Hello and welcome. My name is James Pawelski. I'm professor of practice and director of the Humanities and Human Flourishing project in the Positive Psychology Center at the University of Pennsylvania. The Humanities and Human Flourishing project explores connections between the arts, humanities, and well-being. As a part of this project, we brought together groups of scholars across 8 different disciplines in the arts and humanities, including my own discipline of philosophy, to discuss ways in which these disciplines connect to the conceptualization and the cultivation of human flourishing. Each of these groups was led by a disciplinary chair who helped us to convene a diverse set of scholars and then served as the editor of the volume of essays we have published in each discipline. I am pleased to be joined today by Selma Holo, who is full professor of art history and executive director of museums at the University of Southern California. Selma, welcome and thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me.
So Selma, I wonder if we could begin on a personal note. Can you tell us about a time when your involvement in the visual arts contributed to your well-being?
Well, I can tell you about a time when contact with the visual arts actually shaped me and I think contributed enormously to my sense of well-being in the world. And that was when I was a little girl. We used to belong to the Art Institute of Chicago. My father had a life membership. I was very proud of that. And we would be dropped off on Saturdays and wander around for a few hours, and then he'd pick us up. So it was a kind of exercise in independence, as well as the contact with the arts. And one day I came across a picture just by accident. It was called The Song of the Lark by an artist named Breton. And in that picture, there was a girl with a bandana in a field. And she was looking up at what you could barely make out as a kind of a bird, the song of the lark. At that moment, a little girl from the suburbs of Chicago sort of understood that the longing that we all feel could be transferred and translated into just a dream. And you could think about getting away, flying free. The song of the lark would free you. After I saw that picture, I knew I could do anything. And that was in a museum. It was a work of art. And that was the beginning of the story.
That's really beautiful, Selma. Thank you for sharing that with us. So as you then continued your own development and made decisions about what profession to follow and so forth, and you've been immersed in the visual arts and leadership roles in that domain, what do you think the visual arts can help us learn about what well-being is, about what it means to flourish?
I think the visual arts can play a number of roles, but there's a kind of an obvious one that maybe people don't think about as obviously as I think it is, and that is that we can gain an understanding that there are many ways of looking at important things in our lives. So let's say beauty. If you have access to a universal museum, or what we call an encyclopedic museum, and you have the privilege of wandering through, you're going to see over time and space many different things that different people have thought were beautiful, but perhaps were not in your ken, in your sphere of knowledge. And I think what happens as you become involved with and have access with the visual arts on a large scale is that you begin to have a more open mind toward other possibilities of beauty, which is a part of a rich and flourishing life. So I think that that's one of the things that is really very important, is an opening of the mind to different ways of apprehending and framing some of the important things in life.
So what I didn't hear you say, Selma, is that the visual arts would help us identify a particular list or a particular set of knowledge that would be equivalent to flourishing.
No, I don't think that that would be the point. I think the point would be to allow ourselves to be opened up on a kind of creative level of being, that there are an infinite number of ways of being in the world that can translate into beauty, strength, heroism, courage, all the things that we value in most of our lives. So I think that if one were to limit it to say, you know, I love Velázquez and you must see Velázquez because that will open you up to a certain way of nobility, thinking about nobility, I think that that would be a shame. The point would be to have these great monuments, markers of civilization available to you so that you could rethink your life in a creative way and get to your own creativity.
So tell us more about what's happening in art museums, because I think many of us think about an art museum as a place where there are these priceless objects, these art objects, and you kind of go and you look at them, and then you walk out and you say, wow, I've perhaps been in the presence of greatness. But sometimes it can be difficult to know how to engage with them beyond looking at the little, explanation about who did it and when and so forth.
Right.
But what you're talking about is an interactive experience. How tell us more about how that process can work in an art museum.
Well, I think it starts that kind of interactive sense in an art museum starts with accessibility. And one of the trends that we're seeing right now, not everywhere, not all the time, but we're going toward a trend of free entrance. You don't have to pay. Now, sometimes it's like 6 hours a week you don't have to pay, or some supporter will give a free Sunday or whatever. But I think being able to walk in and not have to pay is a very good way to allow people to be able to connect with the works of art. Another thing that we have to understand is, and that we are beginning to understand in the world of the visual arts, is that art doesn't necessarily speak for itself. That we often need to decode and understand what an artist is trying to say. So what you see in museums now is a really big schedule of programming. If you look at any of our major museums, even our university museums and our small museums, they're more and more heavy with panel discussions, artist talks, music and art, poetry and art, films and art, ways to say, okay, you're looking at a great Rembrandt painting. What was happening in Amsterdam at the time? Why did he paint that? Which will allow you to be able to relate much more closely to the work of art. So I think there's a heavy programming aspect, and I think there's also an understanding that we have to get at kids young, and there's an opening up to younger children in ways that are often very creative.
So Selma, you served as the disciplinary chair for the visual arts group, and you edited the volume of essays. What was it about the Humanities and Human Flourishing project that interested you?
Well, I think when one gets deeply into a field, there's often a kind of deep cynicism that permeates the field about whether there's a field or a discipline at all, and that was one of the things that we talked about a lot in our meetings. And I was very interested to see if there was some common thread that we could unearth together among the many aspects of the visual arts as respect to flourishing. I mean, remember, we have artists, we have spectators at museums, we have art historians, we have architects, we have a very big range of people involved in the visual arts. At the heart of it, I do believe that it is all about flourishing. It may be that an artist is expressing something deep and unsettling, but the fact of making the art is often something that allows for flourishing. Or when people go to museums, they may go in feeling really down, but they see certain works of art where they kind of understand that this is a way out of the feelings of misery. And but sometimes you'll look at a Van Gogh. We all know Van Gogh was suffering, yet he made these gorgeous things. And they seem to be gifts, in a way, to us, to be able to come toward a moment of well-being or better being and happiness. So I think I was very touched by the idea that we could excavate the parts of the visual arts that might bring us toward a better and more flourishing state ourselves. But it takes work, because it's not obvious.
So when you think about flourishing, you don't think about the top 0.1% of happy people who are just frolicking and having a grand time. It sounds like you're thinking about flourishing as something that is much more comprehensive. It's a fuller part of life that takes work, you said.
Well, that's why, James, that I love this project. Because, I mean, there may be people in the project who are thinking about happy face. That's fine, that's what they do. But in our groups, it's been much more complex. And as far as my own thinking and process is concerned, I like to think of flourishing as a kind of a process that allows us to go through the many aspects of life that we all share. We have great happy moments when we get married, when we have a baby, when we get our degrees, things like that. But we also go through and have to embrace sadness when we lose a loved one. And I believe that flourishing can actually be the product of facing life in a certain kind of way, with the richness of the humanities. I mean, how many of us have gone through a big loss? And the words of Tennyson have come to mind. The old order changeth, yielding place to new, and God fulfills himself in many ways. Isn't that a comfort to know that there will be change and you'll work your way through it? And even if you're suffering, if you have, I believe, the arts, even more than just the visual arts, the arts to kind of be touchstones of the process toward flourishing, isn't that wonderful? So it's not a negation of sadness, but it's an embrace of the various aspects of life and the idea of having a goal toward flourishing, wherein all of these different parts of the arts and the humanities help you to be a richer person.
I really like that, Selma. So when you're talking about going into an art museum and spending time with some of these works, as you were talking about earlier, it expands your perspective on what human experience can be like. And then, you know, we all go into an art museum in a particular perspective. I mean, it's a particular time in our lives. We're celebrating certain things. We're struggling with other things. And so there's so much in an art museum that can speak to us wherever we're at in that part of our process of flourishing.
And I think there about the art museum itself, I think it's very interesting. You know, I was just talking about the encyclopedic art museums. These are by nature enormous. And I truly believe that you cannot, you know, have like a bucket list and say, I went to the Philadelphia Art Museum, I'm done. You know, that's it. I think that if we make a habit, we've talked a lot about rituals and habits. If you make a habit of going to, let's say, the Encyclopedic Art Museum in your town or nearby, I think there's a way to make it continually rewarding toward flourishing, and that is to visit an old friend, one that gives you solace, one that either continually challenges you, makes you feel happy, makes you feel enriched, comforts you, but also to go towards something that you've never seen before. Make a new friend. Just kind of let your, whatever, you're walking around a gallery, go to what, you know, pulls you toward it. That will continue opening you up toward new experiences and maybe new routes toward flourishing, because every artist is unique. That's why we love them, right? And so if you keep doing that and allowing yourself to be comforted by the touchstones of your experience in the visual arts and constantly opening yourself up to new experiences, you're going to be an evolving person, moving toward flourishing, if you're not already there.
So Selma, let's talk about privilege.
Okay.
Because there are some people who would say, well, art museums, privilege.
Yeah.
Flourishing, privilege. You're just bringing privilege, you know, piling privilege on each other, right? And so can you tell us a little bit, I mean, do you have to have a certain socioeconomic status, a certain position in your community, certain educational level, or a degree from a certain place for flourishing to be important to you? Do you have to have those things to feel at home and to be welcome in an art museum?
I think we know that traditionally that's been the problem, that especially since museums stopped being free and people couldn't just kind of wander in and sort of find a way of blending in. And we also do know that there are people who have cultural privilege and capital, as you know, Bourdieu always points out to us. But I think things are changing, because I think people who run museums understand that nobody will come in the future if we are not cultivating a younger and not necessarily richer, but maybe an audience that would not necessarily feel comfortable in the museum. So if I have a moment, if I could explain an example just from my town, from Los Angeles, at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, there's an incredible program that has affected thousands and thousands and thousands of people who would not normally feel comfortable in a museum. Don't know the rituals, don't know you're not supposed to touch, don't know you're probably not supposed to talk too loud, whatever. And it's called Next Gen. And what happens is, on the weekend at Los Angeles County Museum, you kind of walk up there, and there's a desk, and there are people sitting there from the museum that, if you're a child, you go up to them with your parent, and you say, I want to go into the museum. And they say, we can make you a member. And they make the child a member. They get a tag, a membership. And one of their parents becomes a member as well, for free. And they have absolute access to the museum. And then there are programs, drawing workshops, artist walks, ways of kind of making the museum a part of the lives of those who are not so privileged as to have it naturally a part of their lives, who don't have the cultural capital. I think we're all in the museum world conscious of that now. And I think we're all really on a path toward trying to achieve a kind of cultural justice that certainly has not existed, up until, I wouldn't say it exists now, but we certainly hope it will exist more, because otherwise there won't be museums in the future.
Well, I think those moves are so important for so many reasons. It sounds, Selma, as though you're saying, too, that the artworks that people can get greater access to aren't just addressing problems for the privileged, that they're addressing human problems in some way. And so by broadening out the audiences who feel welcomed in these places, that they too can experience that enlargement, that expansion in ways that could be helpful to them in their own lives, in their own quest for flourishing.
Right. I think so. And I don't think that works of art are always addressing problems. I think they are also celebrating moments. So again, if you're privileged and you go into museums, this will become clear immediately. But it's wonderful to see kids going to museums who are from areas where they don't necessarily have this kind of habit formed, and remembering, I think it was Hermann Hesse in Narcissus and Goldman said that the value of a work of art is that it rescues a moment from the dance of death. Okay, so just think of, happening upon a still life, apples, oranges, a rose, whatever it might be, and you stop in front of it, and you say, "Oh my goodness, I have that in my backyard. I see that every day, but I never saw it that way." And I think that is as valuable as helping to solve problems, to slow us down, to stop us a bit, to understand that there is richness in every one of our lives every day, and that we just have to be able to apprehend it, to frame it, to claim it, and being in a place where that is celebrated is as important, I think, as solving great problems. And then if that becomes available to everybody who goes to the museum, which in the world I would like us to have, and we're not that far from having it, frankly, it's not an insolvable thing, I think that is a great gift.
That makes so much sense, Selma, because when we have identified a problem in our lives, sometimes we become so focused on resolving that problem that we can't see anything else about our lives. Or we get so caught up in our to-do list that we're like, oh, I don't have time for anything. But by making time to go into an art museum and, like you said, just kind of slowing down and being reminded about some of the fundamentally important things in our lives, in our environment, that can really be of great value. I want to ask you a question about individuals versus groups or communities. So would you say that the role of visual arts for well-being is for individuals? You go in and you see this art. Is it for communities? Like, how does that all work together?
In a way, James, it's for all of those, but they have to be parsed. So I think that the visual arts can be about the artist, because an artist, I believe, a true artist has no choice but to make art. So by making art, just by making the art, that single person is flourishing. The minute you have an audience, a studio visit by a curator, it's like two people, that are involved. And then maybe you get a small show, and there's your family and your friends come, whatever. If you ultimately land up in a museum, you become part of the museum's mission to translate that individual experience of creation to a more mass or public experience. And then when masses of people, the public, people who never knew about you before, come and see you either in a group show or in a show, then it becomes a kind of public experience. Now, that's talking about contemporary art, of course, but if you're dealing with Cycladic or ancient Babylonian or whatever art, then, of course, they're already in the museums, and I do believe that they are there to translate what the scholars, the deep scholars, for whom visual arts also exist, right? Because they're art historians, their job is to criticize it, their job is to speak to the maybe 10 people who will read their journal article. That's another subgroup. If you're talking about architects, they are making spaces for people, maybe generations of people, to be comforted in, to feel solace from. to feel at home in. So I think the beauty about the visual arts is that there are many constituencies for the flourishing that the visual arts offers, from the most minute and atomic to the biggest blockbuster exhibition kind of things where people walk out and they say, oh my God, I never saw so much gold in my life, and look how beautiful it is. Makes me feel rich.
I love it. That's really a beautiful perspective and a beautiful vision. My final question
Yes.
for you, Selma, is moving into thinking about the future. So what do you hope will happen as a result of this Humanities and Human Flourishing project, the volume and so forth? Moving forward, how do you hope that that will shift connections between visual arts and well-being?
I'm hoping that that through our session and through our volume, that we're going to be able to expand the idea of who can be touched by the visual arts. And I think if you had invited another person, you might have had all art history. And that would have been fine, and it would have been like a confirmation that art history is for like 12 people on the planet, serious art history. But I think because you allowed me to bring in a wide range of people involved in the visual arts, that we can talk about it in a more expansive way, and we can speak to each other. So I know that, for example, our architect, Kulapat Yantrases from Thailand, who is a wonderful architect, he is involved with redesigning art museums now. And that's really a wonderful thing, because I think that his involvement with us might help him understand how there might be different ways that people who really care about the arts would like things to be shown so that more people could understand them. And I think we're going to see the results of that with all of us. I also think that by the way our disciplinary consultation was organized, we have scholars from ancient times up to contemporary times, and that we can begin to see that there are both problems and solutions that range across time and space. So even though we have a lot that's new and new problems, on the other hand, there still is nothing new under the sun. We keep repeating, and I think making a little progress, but I wouldn't go too far with that right now.
Well, Selma, thank you so much for being with us today, and thank you for your terrific work as the disciplinary chair of the Visual Arts Group. We really appreciate that.
Thank you, James. I loved it.
And thank you for joining us as well in this fascinating discussion with Selma Holo. We look forward to seeing you again as we continue our discussions, exploring connections between the arts, humanities, and well-being.